So, what is CRPT? CRPT is a technique that stands for Consensus Reality Perception Technique. And it's a tool that we began using with neurodivergent clients because after going through some extensive training and research around a method called the Davis method, which I used with two of my children to help them with dyslexia. I see so much value in the system, and the designer, the founder and creator is just an absolutely brilliant man named Ron Davis, and I think he does a pretty good job of really keeping to the gifts of the different forms of neurodivergence that he goes into with the Davis method. But a lot of the language around the different techniques in the method I kind of took issue with and didn't want to use with my clients, and I thought it's actually a really great springboard for what you might call brain balancing, but I wanted to create a new language that I felt like was maybe a little bit more accurate. And also, I wanted to be able to create some visual representation of what this method can help someone to do. And so I created these graphics called the sensory processing spectrum. And originally I was looking at it kind of in the shape of a butterfly, because I was noticing a lot of balance, out of balance, imbalance spectrums that happen with these sensory processing spectrums. So within the whole sensory processing differences world, we have hyposensory perception, where there are senses that are not processed or recognized as easily. They're lowered sensory awareness around those things. And then there's hypersensory perception on the other end, where there's hyper awareness of sensory input. And we tend to see this spectrum with representative words like autism or ADHD. When someone is sensory seeking, they tend to get a label of ADHD. When someone is sensory avoiding, they tend to get a label of autism. And most of the neurodiverse world, the neurocomplex beings that are out there, have a mix of both sensory seeking and sensory avoiding, hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity to certain sensory input. So I wanted to be able to put this in kind of a graph form to help you determine where on this flow chart you sit. And this changes. It is absolutely not static. So when I created this flow chart, I meant for it to be looked at as a flow. We are never sitting still on these lines of the spectrum. However, depending on what day you're perceived, you may have traits that lend more towards looking like an autistic label, or towards traits that look like an ADHD label, depending on where you're at in this flow chart of sensory input perception. So then, after sharing those graphics, I got some feedback from one of my neurodivergent clients, which, man, I love working with that community, because the feedback that you get is fantastic. And one of the feedback, one form of the feedback that I got was talking about how there's a third component, and that third component being time. And when you add the time component to this XY axis that I designed, you get a torus shape, which is really fascinating. And it really shows that interwoven movement between states in this sensory processing spectrum, and I loved that. But it also makes that still point at the center what I like to call the CRPT point. This is that balance point. And again, I want to be very clear with language. Just because the balance point is the consensus reality perception, we want to be able to tune into the consensus reality. That does not make the consensus reality the correct way of thinking and being. It just means that we're able to tap into it when we choose to, and also move out of it when we need to. So to show you what I mean by this, I want to give you kind of a visual. So we all know that when we stand balanced on 2 feet, I don't know how far I need to go back to be seen. So I can be balanced on 2 feet, right? Just like this. And I'm in this moment, I'm very balanced between my left and right side of myself. However, if a ball is thrown way over here, I have to move myself off of that balance point to catch the ball. Now I'm still staying in balance, but I'm moving more towards this side, and I'm on my right leg, and I use that and I make that conscious choice to reach that ball that's up here. I may also, if something is falling down here and I need to catch it, I need to move and maybe even come forward this way. So this is what happens on some level with neurodivergent thinking. We are able to tap into that consensus reality point, some easier than others, where we're right in the center of hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity. But we also want to be able to tap into the other states at times, and all humans do this. This is just a spectrum, again. So all humans do this, all people do this. If we are in a state of trauma, we may, out of love and protection for our nervous system, go into a hypo awareness of our sensory input because we need to tune it out to be able to cope in those moments. We also, when we need to be on high alert to protect ourselves, may swing into that hypersensitivity state. So you can understand from that perspective why it's really helpful to be able to tap into all of the places on this spectrum, because at different points in our life we may need them more than others. When we're well-resourced, we tend to move back towards center, only because we don't need to be hypo or hyper aware based on trauma or coping techniques. This does not mean that center is the preferred state. It means that center is the place that you springboard from. So we all want to be able to access that center and that balance when we choose. But it's also a gift to be able to shift into these other states of awareness to be able to create, because you don't get innovation and creation by sitting in the consensus reality perspective. Nobody creates new things by sitting in the center of the consensus reality consciousness. We have to move outside of it to create something new. That is why I want to teach a method that allows you to move in and out of these states. So another way to look at it would be to be able to zoom in or zoom out of details. When we are hyper aware of something, we're very zoomed in. We're seeing every little detail and every little nuance and every little emotion on the face, and we're hyper aware and hyper vigilant. That's a zoomed in state. But also that can cause us to miss things back here, right? So if we're totally zoomed in, sometimes you can miss the forest for the trees, and we need to be able to zoom back as well and see all the trees and have this zoomed out abstract perspective and be able to move in and out of these states at will. So that's this internal and external line as well in the center of this graphic. We have an internal and external line. That means being able to zoom in and be aware of hypo and hyper aware of what is happening in the body. And ideally we want to be balanced in that so that we are tuned into our body, but not hyper aware of our body until that hypo or hyper awareness serves us. Then we also want to be able to do the same thing in our external world. We want to be able to pull our focus out of our body onto the external and be sensing either in balance, hypo or hyper aware. The key is shifting between all of these states fluidly and in a way that doesn't cause overwhelm, burnout, or meltdown. So I'm going to show you these images and graphics to kind of explain what I mean by these things that I just kind of launched into. Maybe having a visual is more helpful to understand what I mean by these like kind of teeter-totter balances. And then I'm going to show you one practical way that this looks in life. So let me flip my, oh, it's not gonna let me flip my camera on. Okay, well, I'm gonna attach the images. That way you can look at it. So the XY axis, along the X line, I have on this side, hyposensory perception, and on this side, hypersensory perception. And along this line, the more you move towards hypersensory perception, the more hypervigilant you are to all the details that are happening around you. So on an extreme hypersensitivity perspective will be internal and externally hypersensitive. And in overwhelm, that's going to look like on the very, very polar extreme of hypersensory perception, you're going to have a very anxious person, high anxiety. You move to the opposite end of that spectrum. You're going to go to the other polar opposite, and we have hyposensory perception. So that is sensory avoiding, that is internally and externally being under aware of the sensory perceptive state. So in that state, when you are hypo aware of both internal and external sensory input, you're going to experience depression on that extreme end, where everything kind of feels meh, because, or worse than that. So on the extreme end of hyper, we have anxiety. On the extreme end of hypo, we have depression and repression. But most of us move between these states. When we get overwhelmed, we begin sensory avoiding. Our traits begin to look more like what we would see on the autism spectrum. And then when we hit that level of hypo sensory perception, we start to feel a little depressed. We start sensory seeking to find that inspiration. This is extremely common on that ADHD spectrum, where the neurodivergent person is moving between these states, but this is also the creation cycle. So this really aligns well with that theory of positive disintegration outlined by Dabrowski, where we move between the sensory seeking and sensory avoiding states. That is why I feel like, and I had told John this, I don't know, months ago, more than months ago, that I think that all of these terms, autism, dyslexia, ADHD, sensory processing disorders, they all have the same root, which is sensory processing differences. And we're in these different states. You could plot yourself on this flowchart in different areas. And when it's represented in what we would stereotypically see as autism traits, you'll get an autism diagnosis. And when it's chose and is displayed in the traits that we traditionally associate with ADHD, you could get an ADHD diagnosis. And then the ADHD is when they really see these cycles clearly of going between these two sensory seeking and sensory avoiding states. So that CRPT point is that balance point in the center where you can access all of this spectrum when it is needed or necessary, and yet you can pull back to center and feel in balance. And we call this the consensus perception technique, the consensus reality perception technique. So I'm going to go into that a little bit further in other videos, but I wanted to give you a quick look at what I mean by CRPT technique.